Realife with John Christopher is brought to you in part by Brown Harris Stevens of the Hamptons, serving the East End with offices on the South Fork from West Hampton to Montauk and the North Fork from Aquabog to Orient Point. Brown Harris Stevens of the Hamptons is also the exclusive affiliate of Christie's International Real Estate. Information is available at johnfchristopher@gmail.com.
Welcome back to Real Life, and this is John Christopher, and today I have as my guest Mike Ferruggia, who is a partner of Ferruggia and Callisto, and also, interestingly enough, an expert on TRID, T-R-I-D. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Great, John. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking about TRID because I think there's a lot of people, especially agents, agencies, and lawyers, that are still in the dark about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau implementing a regulation with this acronym, TRID. First of all, can you tell us, what is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
Sure, John. The CFPB, as it's commonly known as, is a new executive regulatory agency that was established under the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act in 2010. Since 2012, when the CFPB really started amping up, their actions in the industry has increased hundredfold each and every year. They're becoming quite the player in real estate transactions all across the country.
Where did they get their funding from?
Well, that's probably one of the biggest complaints about the CFPB is that because they are an executive agency within the Federal Reserve, they don't have a budget, so to speak. It's more or less of a blank check. And when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of money that this agency can spend in the enforcement of their own regulations, it does come into some criticism.
So what does TRID stand for?
TRID stands for, forgive me, John, there's acronyms within the acronym, so I didn't design it. The T
we'll leave it to the government, right?
Exactly. The T stands for the Truth in Lending Act. The R stands for RESPA, or the Real Estate Settlement and Procedures Act, Integrated Disclosures. So TRID stands for the TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rules.
So is TRID eliminating anything? Or?
Oh, sure. Before the enforcement of the TRID, or the effectiveness of the TRID regulations, which are, by the way, John, they're effective October 3rd of this year. So they're now in effect for all loan applications. Beforehand, a borrower who's seeking mortgage financing, they would be provided by their lender an initial good faith estimate, an initial truth in lending, and then at closing they would get final good faith estimates and final truth in lendings, and then what most people are familiar with, the HUD-1 settlement statements. So all of those are now gone. And they are all replaced with two disclosures that the CFPB has designed. The first is called the LE, or the loan estimate, and the second is it's called the closing disclosure, or CD. And the LE is designed to be provided to the borrower at least 3 business days after, within 3 business days after they submit a loan application. And the biggest change is the providing of the CD. This closing disclosure is all the final numbers that a borrower will realize upon closing, and the biggest shift here is that disclosure is being provided to the borrowers a minimum of 3 business days before closing, which I think is a wonderful thing.
So in the final disclosure there, the buyer has the opportunity to see who all the players are, correct? And also what their final tally will be in closing costs, I imagine.
Correct? Yes.
Now, one of the things that I find interesting, which in the past, before this came into effect, if there was any discrepancies, attorneys had the ability, when I say discrepancies, maybe they were off a few cents someplace, or there was something that hadn't been addressed, and they said, okay, we'll put that in escrow. We'll hold that in escrow and then deal with it after the closing. That now is no longer possible. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily, but it's certainly not best practice.
Okay.
The whole underlying theme under TRID, and the CFPB for that matter, is transparency, uniformity in the industry. And with those in mind, if attorneys are setting up side escrow agreements at the closing without the proper procedure of disclosing them to the lender, that could be questionable conduct. And that's why it's ultimately important that counsel now more than ever really take the extra time to educate their clients as to what is expected of them at the closing so that these can be avoided entirely.
So what you're saying now, attorneys should be aware of TRID so that they can facilitate the transaction process and move it along. If there's any, they only have 3-day windows is what basically along the way.
That's for the lender, sure. In order for the lender to meet that 3-day window, that means all the practitioners have to supply information in a sufficient period of time so that the lender is able to do so. What that's going to ultimately result in is that once these TRID loans start closing, we are going to have to schedule them pretty far in advance.
Well, let me ask this question. I know a lot of times people lock in rates. Say we'll use a buyer in this instance. The buyer doesn't have an attorney who's versed in TRID. Mm-hmm. So you're moving all the way along. You're saying, okay, we're at the closing. And of course, there's some documentation that's missing. What happens? Do they go back to the beginning again and in the process have to go through this? And time-wise, could they lose the lock-in?
It's certainly possible. And under TRID, they would not have gotten that far. They would not have gotten to the closing if all the documentation was not in place a sufficient period of time before closing so that the lender can generate these disclosures.
Interesting. Okay. So how did you become aware of TRID?
Well, John, I've been teaching and speaking about Dodd-Frank and all its related issues as it affects the real estate market for several years now. I've been teaching I've had a 3-hour course on Dodd-Frank alone, and doing so, I've been very aware of the CFPB and very aware that these new regulations were coming down the pike. So we've kept a very close eye on them, and they're now finally in effect.
Right. So your recommendation is that agents and agencies and attorneys become aware of TRID, I imagine.
Without question.
Right.
It's a whole new world.
So, Mike, you have offices in Southampton and Central Islip. Is there another way somebody could reach you if they have questions about TRID or want to employ your legal expertise?
Of course. They can contact my assistant, Josephine, at 631-232-0030.
What is that again? One more time.
631-232-0030. She's at 201, and she can schedule a personal consultation, or you can email me at info@fclawfirm.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the program, Mike.
Thank you, John.
You're quite welcome. This is John Christopher for Realife, and we'll be right back with my next guest, James and Linda Eklund, who are the proprietors of the Ram's Head Inn.